Hey friends, this is Travis. I'm the media director here, and you're watching Interactive Wednesday. Before we get started, I'm gonna ask you to do two things. One, hit that share button. I cannot overemphasize how great it is whenever you guys share this stream out with the world. We reach over 100 people for every share that we get. The other day we got 2 shares. Guess how many people we reached? About 250. A week before though, we got like 10 or 12 shares and we reached over 1,000 people. So help us out, hit that share button, and then jump into the comments and tag somebody. Let them know that, hey, I'm watching Interactive Wednesday and you should come to church with me tonight. Pastor Zach and Gina have an amazing word. We're gonna press into the presence of God and experience Him tonight. Get ready, here we go, 60 seconds, boom.
Hey, well, welcome. This is a Wednesday night, and you are joining us. My name is Zach.
And I'm Gina.
She is my wife.
Yes.
And I'm her husband. Yeah.
Welcome to Wednesday night with us.
Welcome. We're just going to gaze into the camera for a while. We'll just make wonderful eye contact with you. Just kidding. I mean, we will, but we're not only going to do that. So tonight we wanted to talk to you a little bit about perspective. And that might sound strange, because what does that even mean? But perspective from the context or the idea of like spiritual warfare and how our perspective affects everything we see and do and how we approach things. Do you want to say anything? So perspective, and like the highest goal, because you can have all kinds of views and where you're at and all that stuff. The highest goal we want is to have heaven's perspective. Now the main question, I think, is like, how do you do that? How do you know if you have heaven's perspective, and how do you know if you're connecting in that area? So it's what we want to talk to you about, and the importance of it, and like how it actually affects all the different areas, particularly spiritual warfare, and what that looks like when you do have heaven's perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we all have like different, whether it's like things that you grew up with your family, culture, mindsets that you've adopted from different things that are normal and like accepted in culture, but that is not kingdom. And so there may be things that even come to mind as like we're talking, that Holy Spirit's like, hey, like maybe look at that. And there may be things like down the road that you're like, oh right, like I remember like them talking about this, like that is what they're talking about. So it may not be like as we're talking, you're like, oh, like lights going off all around. A lot of times these things seem normal to people because we've grown up with them. They've just been our normal thinking, our normal way of life. And so they don't often like strike you as, oh, this like doesn't belong there. So, yeah.
So if you can't tell, in our house we're getting over kind of a cold. So I probably sound extra nasally and got coughs in the kids and all that. Anyway, yeah, so spiritual warfare. Spiritual warfare is largely a battle of perspective. There's this really good book called Indestructible.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, Indestructible, by Blake Healy. And he talks a lot about this, and he's someone who like really sees in the spirit and has wonderful teaching and perspective on what's going on in the spirit realm all around us from just normal things that are common to us, but we just aren't always aware of what's happening. So he talks about it from actually being able to see what's going on with the angelic and demonic and all that stuff. So really cool book, Indestructible. You should check it out. It's all about spiritual warfare. So he talks about that, where spiritual warfare is primarily a battle of perspective. And to kind of draw you a picture of what that looks like commonly, and maybe it's becoming less common now, at least I hope so, but what at least used to be very common and might still be is this oversensitivity and emphasis on the enemy and what the enemy is doing. Now, obviously, it wouldn't be a battle if there wasn't an enemy, right? So there has to be some awareness there. So that's not to say that it should be completely ignored, because that would be ridiculous. But we have generally, the common thing is we become oversensitive on what the enemy's doing and have very little awareness on what God is saying or doing, and what heaven's doing around us and through us.
Which is seen a lot of times, like, if you were a kid, I mean, you were a kid, but like,
if you've ever been a child.
Or if you have kids, it's probably the same. Like, I always was super aware, like, I would feel things, like, I'd go places and, like, I could immediately tell, like, something isn't right. Like, I was more aware of the demonic, and actually it wasn't until, I don't know, like, we started reading the book that Zach was talking about, like, and started becoming more aware of what heaven is doing, that I was like, oh my gosh, like, it was like the light was turned on, and I was like, God is doing so much more, and there's so much more around us that is heaven than, like, we are even aware of.
Yeah. And, like, so there's some things that are right, so I'll list some of that. Like, when you're aware of what the enemy is doing, it's an absolutely right response to be ticked off at what he's doing, to be fed up with it, to use your authority to cut off what the enemy is doing. All of that's good and right, but that there's actually a proper place for it. And the higher reality, I believe, is to connect first with what heaven is doing, and to put it as bluntly as possible, when you connect with what heaven is doing and you're more aware of that, and the voice of the Holy Spirit and all that stuff, when you're more aware of that side, it ends up kind of taking care of the enemy stuff. It's almost like a natural byproduct, because when you're connecting with what heaven is doing and speaking out and using your authority that way, you end up addressing the enemy stuff, but you're actually doing it from God's way, not just the way we think is right. And sometimes the way we think is right does line up with what God is doing. So it's not to say that the ways we're familiar with, like if you're someone who, when you're doing your spiritual warfare thing, it's like intense, and like you're like even shouting at the devil, not to reference the Motley Crue song, but like where you're just shouting and going at it. Not that that's never right, but sometimes we put so much emphasis on tearing down what the enemy is doing and never actually paying attention to building with what God is doing.
Or even like asking God, like, what's actually going on here? Like, what are you doing? So like you actually know what to take authority over, or like what to do. Like, a lot of times we're like just saying things that we don't need to.
Right. And that's really good. The concept there would be, when you tear something down, that's real. But if you don't build something up to take its place, so the concept is displacement. If you have an environment that is, let's just say, breeds fear, you can tear down fear all day. And I'm not saying it doesn't work, but if the environment that produces it, that's set up, that produces it, isn't taken care of and replaced with something, then it just comes right back. Like, you can tear it down day after day after day after day, but if you don't displace it and change the environment that produces it, it's very temporary. Mm-hmm. So the idea with heaven's perspective versus overemphasizing being focused on the enemy, when you focus on heaven's perspective and do stuff with that and build up, you are actually displacing what the enemy is doing, and it doesn't even have room to do what they're
Right.
trying to do.
It reminds me like the verse, perfect love casts out fear. So if you think of that, like perfect love casts out fear. Like inviting love in, perfect love is actually taking care of fear for you.
Instead of just yelling at fear.
Right.
Not that it's never wrong to send fear on its way. I mean, like, it's both. So this isn't a get rid of the things you used to think necessarily, unless you just believed wrongly, in which case, switch that. But it's a both thing. And it's like each thing has its own place. But that's perfect. Like, the perfect love casts out fear. The point isn't to spend all your time like getting rid of fear, but the point is to connect with perfect love, invite that in, and make that be the dominating force in the atmosphere. Which, if that's like weird terminology, atmosphere is just what's around you,
Right.
or like in your home, or the atmosphere you create with your words, with your attitudes, with your actions. I mean, all the stuff affects that. So the atmosphere is just like what is in the air around you, which we're all familiar with that. Like if you walk into a powerful worship service in a church service, and it's just like we are in the throne room, the atmosphere is charged with like his presence in whatever way that looks like in the moment. Or if you walk into a home that's just filled with like arguments and yelling and all strife and all that kind of stuff, you feel it. So like that's the atmosphere, if you're not familiar with that. So heaven's perspective is vital. Now the question is like, how do we build into connecting with that? My wife is very good at this.
I'm always jerks anyway.
How do you connect with heaven atmosphere or perspective?
Well, I think just most of the time is just asking Holy Spirit, like, what are you doing? So in whatever situation you might be feeling, like, so you're always going to discern yourself first in your situation. So if you're feeling something weird, you're discerning yourself first. That's your first role. Just how it works. And you'll kind of like, you can test it, but like most of the time it's true. And so after that, like, you might sense something else that's going on. But the key is don't just stop there. Like growing up, I always just stopped at what the enemy was doing, what I was feeling. But the next thing would be to ask Holy Spirit, like, what are you doing? What is heaven saying? What is heaven doing right now? Because heaven is always doing things. God is always doing things. It's just that our awareness is not always aware of what's going on. Most of the time we just stop at what the enemy is doing and we don't pull in what heaven is doing so we can connect to it.
Yeah. What I love is I don't remember where it's at, but the verse that talks about we have the power to bind on earth and it'll be bound in heaven, and loose on earth and it'll be loosed in heaven, and that whole thing. So like we have the power to bind, and you could look at that as like what we do with the enemy or darkness. Like when you see something, you bind it or you can break it or whatever, and that's great. We should do some of those things when it's appropriate. But how much more powerful to connect with what he's designed and the authority he's given us by building and releasing, and whether it's actions, words, or anything like that, like the ability we have to build. I mean, I don't know if there's a better way to say it than to build, to create, like we have this crazy, insane power and authority that he has given us, that's him, but that his spirit within us has the ability to create and do things. And if you just look at like the life of Jesus, the thing that always amazes me, that's in kind of in contrast to what it looks like in deliverance ministries the way we're mostly familiar with, just thinking about the demonic. So like spiritual warfare, the demonic and stuff. Like when Jesus confronted demons or any kind of manifestation like that, it never looked like he tried very hard. In fact, most of the time he pretty much ignored them and just dealt with the person and brought healing and restoration and freedom. But it never seemed like it was difficult. And so like think of what his perspective was. He did what he saw the Father doing, and he said what he was saying. And he was completely guided by the Holy Spirit. He was filled with power. All of that stuff that is who we are now, that he's created us to be. Like when it came to spiritual warfare, perspective, the way he conducted himself in these types of settings, it always seemed really easy. And it's not like it was easy because he was God, though he is. It was easy because he was demonstrating like what is available to us and how we can live and walk. And the difference is, and Ian Carroll says it this way, that most deliverance ministry, their doctrine comes from demons itself, which is absolutely hilarious and sad at the same time. That like a lot of deliverance ministries, their beliefs and methods are actually developed from, if you go into history, and I'm not going to go through like listing them, but you can go through like some of like the common ones, and what has become accepted as normal is largely taught from the demonic. And like, what is the demonic and the enemy? They lie and deceive and distract and trick and all the stuff. And like, how silly is that? So like with spiritual warfare, how about we look at it and approach it the way Jesus did, which is entirely different from what is normal for a lot of us.
I was thinking like back, I don't know, years ago, like the idea of like spiritual warfare or like intercession or things like that. I was like, I will never do that because I don't know what I'm doing. Like, I don't know how to do that. I don't know like all the tricks or the, you know, like all the things, because that's what I thought it was like. And then the more I started learning about heaven and what like God has provided and what we can tap into, it like took all the pressure off of me. Because before it was like you had to know all these things and to get any results, where like God's like, no, like just rely on me, like lean on me and invite heaven in, and like you don't have to rely on yourself to make all of this happen, because one, it wouldn't happen, like you're not going to get anywhere. But he just makes it very easy for us, like if we can change our mindset from what is normal and accepted into kingdom's perspective. Even like the other day I was telling Zach that the idea of failure like is very normal, like, and so you'll hear people talking about like it's okay to fail, like allow yourself to fail, like things like that. And I would have been one that I was like, yeah, like, you know, I have a hard time failing, but like I'm gonna let myself do something and fail. And God was just like, that's not kingdom. And I was like, what? I was really, really having a hard time with that. He was like, no, like failure, there's no failure with me. Like a kid learning to walk, they might fall, but they get up and there's a growth, there's, you know, learning and all of that. But failure is set up by your own standards, it's set up by your own expectations, it's what the world created to say like, here's how I'm gonna measure success. And God's like, no, like that's not kingdom. Like I never created that measurement, like that was not me. And so just in like all the little areas like of our thinking, and even in the church, we've adopted things that are just not kingdom. It's just become normal to us.
Yeah, falling is not the same as failure. Similar concepts, but not.
Right. failure is very much like, I am a failure.
Which connects with shame. And shame is also not God's way. We could go on a whole bunch of trails here.
Yes. Rein it in.
Yeah. So another thing Blake Healy says in his book, he says this. He says, seeing from heaven's perspective is not about getting a direct answer or solution. Which, stop and think about that right there. Most of the time when we're praying or asking God about stuff, it's just to like get the answer or for him to solve a problem for us. But that's actually not the point of having heaven's perspective, and also just relationship with God. Like, he's not a magic genie to give us what we want all the time and to give us all the answers to our problems, though he does some of those things. But like, it's actually about relationship. So anyway, like, it's not about getting the answer and the solution to all the problems, but seeing from heaven's perspective is engaging with a problem from a place of connection with God. So the main point of heaven's perspective is to be in connection with God. And the reality is, though he never leaves us, and it's not like we're ever disconnected from him, that's not the point. But to be connected with God and be in that place it's really a note on attention. Like, where's your attention at? If your attention is on all these other things, your attention and your connection with God is not there because you're focusing on other stuff. It's amazing how God will speak to something when you are connected with him. And I see this all the time in Sozo ministry. God will speak to people, and myself, I've experienced it. And he'll talk about something that seems sometimes so random, like something from the past, like forever ago. And he'll talk to them about this thing, bring healing to it, or revelation that like they never saw it that way, and it like brought so much light to that situation, or to even their whole life, really. And just being connected with him and seeing something the way he sees it and hearing what he's saying will shift all these other things. And it's like this domino effect that seeing and hearing what he is saying and how he sees something like a problem, it will change the whole thing. And sometimes just it makes the whole thing go away. No, it's not always that simple, but I mean, it's amazing what connecting with him and just staying in connection with him and having your attention be on his voice and presence shifts all the stuff that we can end up wasting a lot of time on. Did you have anything else? I think that might be it. Just the last thing that I wanted to put on there was distractions, because there's a lot of things you could talk about with heaven's perspective and spiritual warfare. One thing that I think is very common right now, because I've experienced it and I've heard from a number of people who have brought this up, is distraction. And it was put like this, that like distraction in and of itself is not, well, rephrase that. It's not the things you're being distracted with necessarily that are the problem, because sometimes they're normal, even necessary things. But the enemy can like twist all of these things where it becomes this endless cycle of your attention being pulled this way and that way. And sometimes it's serious things. So it's not to say that like everything is bad and should be thrown out. But this idea of distraction, which keeps us oftentimes fighting the wrong battles and putting our energy where it doesn't need to be and just wasting it. And that connects right with like how we can get into spiritual warfare mode and we're fighting the enemy so much from this place of like he's this powerful God who has the right to do anything in our lives unless we've given him the right. And like waste all this time and energy on battles that are already won. And like that's just one example of like distractions that the enemy will keep us in this cycle of going like this way and this way and this way and this way when we just need to be focused. And it doesn't mean those things never need attention, but it's amazing, like we just talked about, that staying connected with God and his perspective and his voice will end up handling a lot of things, even as a natural byproduct, that you won't even need to put much energy or time and attention to other things. Or when you do, it'll just be like a natural flow. And it just is easier that way. So distractions is big.
Which is a plug for Transformation Ministries. If you've never had a sozo, I highly recommend them. Because sometimes you just need like having someone else there to like walk you through meeting with Jesus, and like it just is really the gentlest form. Like there's no crazy yelling, or it's super gentle.
Unless you really want to yell.
It's really just encountering the Lord and letting him like turn on lights where they need to be turned on, or maybe just love you in certain areas. So that's really all it is.
So that's it. Just to wrap it up, like it's all about having heaven's perspective, and how you do that is to pursue connection with him and have that be the focus, and not so much what the enemy is doing and getting distracted with all that kind of stuff. And it's really that simple. It's just staying connected with him and keeping your attention there. Sometimes it's a battle, but it's not very complicated.
Yeah.
And that's it. All right. Well, bless you guys. Thank you for joining us for this wonderful time with this husband and wife.
See you guys.
Bye.
Zach and Gina, thank you so much for that word. Thank you for pressing into the Spirit. Thank you for pushing our church where it needs to be in God's presence. Thank you for just imagining with us what Holy Spirit might want to do and going after that with all your hearts. You guys are amazing. Grace family, thank you so much for being here tonight, for being part of Interactive Wednesday. Don't forget, you can always support the vision of Grace. And I want to tell you about one thing before you go, and that's Easter. It's in like 1 month, and we have this giant Good Friday event planned where we're going to bring out the whole community. So we need your help in a couple ways. One, tell people about it. Invite people you love that need to hear the message of Jesus and experience the love of God that you experience at Grace. We want to see people encounter God and engage in their kingdom purpose. Speaking of kingdom purpose, you have a role to play in this Easter event. Whether that means you donate some cash so we can go out and buy the supplies that we need for the event, or maybe that means you actually donate some supplies like supplies to Easter eggs for the egg scramble that we're going to be doing. All those details are online at gracesternly.com, and you can go there and get them. But I want you to pray about, hey God, how do you want me to be involved? And if you're not sure, send us a message. We got a place for you. Before you go, one more thing, take a minute in that chat, go and write down one thing that you learned from Zach and Gina's talk tonight. There was so much. Share it with us. Let us know that you're hearing it. Maybe you have a perspective that somebody else doesn't have. Be interactive. It's Interactive Wednesday. Love you guys. Have a great week. See you soon.